Well, welcome to all of you who are here physically and to the others who are joining us through the internet. It's my pleasure today to welcome Professor Jeffrey Ding from George Washington University, where he's an assistant professor of political science. His own career took him from an undergraduate degree in Iowa, and I just learned that he was an Iowa native who went to the local university, Hooray for Public Education, and then from there became a Rhodes Scholar and went to Oxford, where he did his PhD, concluding his studies in 2021. He is part of a generation that I like to see growing, who are interested in the cross-section between international relations and technology policy. And he has published in a number of leading journals, Security Studies, International Studies Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, and others on selective topics. But today we're really here to talk about the big book. And I do mean big, not so much in pages. It's relatively compact. And to help sales, it's readable. And it's entitled Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, How Diffusion Shapes Economic Competition. Jeffrey and I will have a chance to go back and forth a little bit briefly after he does a presentation about the book. And then I'm going to be opening it up to questions both from the audience here and people online. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to GPS and to the 21st Century China program, Professor Jeffrey Ding. Thanks.
Great, thank you. No, thank you to the center, to Sherry, to Susan for coordinating all this, and really grateful to be introduced by Peter. I was just telling him that as I was coming up in grad school trying to study technology and international relations, Peter has done some of the foundational works in this space, so it's cool to see this growing subfield and more people doing work in this area. Okay. This has been in the news a bit recently, U.S. China AI competition. We're all interested in it. And I start with this image for two reasons. The first is the geopolitical stakes of this competition over global technology leadership. Who is going to win this AI race? Second reason is, well, how many of you play chess? Okay. What's wrong with this image?
Not possible.
Right, the kings don't actually touch each other in chess. And I think that speaks to a deeper truth about all of our conversations and research and policymaking about U.S. China AI competition. We have a very muddled picture about what we're actually competing over. Maybe one starting point. This is Chinese leader Xi Jinping. He gives a speech at the BRICS summit, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, all these emerging economies that are making up more and more of the world's population and global economic output. And this summit is on the theme of the fourth industrial revolution. Note how in this speech, he's explicitly calling back to these past three industrial revolutions and how they shape the development trajectory of human history. Now, what happens in the Chinese system is after leaders make speeches, analysts and commentators go back and try to decipher and interpret those speeches. Okay, so here's an authoritative Chinese Communist Party publication, the Study Times, 学习时报. They go back a few months later to that speech, parse through it a little bit more, and note the details that emerge. These same past industrial revolutions led to shifts in productivity leadership. Which country became the most advanced, productive industrial power? Those of you in political science or international relations, that might sound familiar to you, right? The classic text by historian Paul Kennedy. There is this regular pattern by which great powers rise and fall. And it involves technology and economic change and geopolitical and military influence, but I want to draw your attention to the first step. Changes in technology lead to differentials in economic growth rates. The more productive power is able to sustain long-term economic growth differentials, and then that's going to impact geopolitical and military power. So that's what the book focuses on, that first step. How do these dramatic periods of technological change actually lead to a shift in the global economic balance of power? Standard story might be pretty familiar to you all, especially being in California. This idea that one country monopolizes cutting-edge innovation in these fast-growing industries called leading sectors. And that they're able to reinvest those exports that they gain, all the profits, and eventually become the world's most productive economy. So Dan Dresner sums it up pretty simply. Great power becomes a hegemon through a near monopoly on innovation in leading sectors. Pretty influential perspective where I live and work in DC. Some examples of these leading sectors building off of Walt Rostow's work, a development economist, which political scientists have largely adopted. So think cotton textiles in the Industrial Revolution, steel and chemicals in the Second Industrial Revolution, the automobile industry. A lot of these became the largest sector in an economy. Not saying these aren't important, but the book proposes an alternative explanation for how technological revolutions affect the rise and fall of great powers based on general purpose technologies. Key thing about these GPTs is they're not contained in just one sector. They are fundamental transformations that have the ability to spread and transform all these different application sectors throughout the entire economy. One way to think about it is, I know a few people in the room study electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are really, really important. I think electric vehicles are a leading sector, not a GPT. The difference between AI, which has the potential to be a general purpose technology, and electric vehicles is what's happening in AI is fundamentally transforming what's happening in electric vehicles. What's advances in electric vehicles are not fundamentally transforming the field of AI, right? One technology is more enabling than the other. Like so many times, maybe a lot of you read white papers on technology, reporting on technology, even academic articles on technology. It's almost like you could find and replace electric vehicles for blockchain, for quantum, for AI. It's all just like boilerplate. We need to take differences between technologies seriously, right? If you care about GPTs, then that's going to shape the institutional adaptations and policies that countries need to adopt to diffuse and spread GPTs. And so in the book, I focus on these institutions that widen the base of engineering skills associated with the general purpose technology. The book in a nutshell in one sentence is saying, we think of technology competition among great powers as a sprint to see who can create the most brilliant and brightest Silicon Valleys. It's actually this marathon about who can spread their technologies from their frontier firms and universities between their Silicon Valleys and their Iowa cities, which is what I grew up in. Okay, that was the talk in a nutshell. I'm going to do a little bit more theory stuff. I'll probably speed through it, but then we'll test the argument on the historical cases with the focus on the Second Industrial Revolution. Then we'll return to that opening chessboard and see what it all means for U.S. China competition in AI. Okay, there's the question. The traditional answer says, let's focus on that most dramatic aspect of technological change that shows up in the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the technologists that grace the covers of all these different magazines, this eureka moment where we come up with this new to the world innovation, right? What is the next generation product that Qualcomm here close to San Diego is going to come out with next? And so our existing explanations are about, okay, can this country develop the institutions to monopolize cutting edge, new to the world innovations in these fast growing sectors? So can you prevent technology from leaking out of your board? Can you develop a really stringent intellectual property rights regime to encourage more cutting edge innovation? Can you invest a lot in cutting edge R&D? Different perspective if we start with general purpose technologies. There's a strong economic history and economics literature on GPTs. I won't go through the details. What I want you to take away here is this quote from Stanford economist Paul David, where he articulates this regular pattern by which GPTs make their mark on the national economy. And it's this gradual and slow process where diffusion is really important. Diffusion is, put simply, is just the spread of a technology across a population of potential users. The difference, what makes GPT special, is the population of potential users is the entire economy. It's not the same for some of these other cutting edge fields like quantum communications or even blockchain or electric vehicles, right? There's only one application or a few applications. For GPTs, that diffusion process might become very, very important and sort of challenges our thinking that only focuses on that initial eureka moment. Now, of course, if you are a country that has a lot of frontier firms and universities and you have strong innovation capacity, it might help you be strong in diffusing a GPT, but it's not determinative. We've all heard of the latecomer's advantage. You're not burdened by legacy or vested interests. And I think it's a bit counterintuitive, but when we're talking about just advanced economies, rising powers and great powers, all of these countries are going to have firms and universities at the technological frontier. Innovation leadership is going to be contested. Just think about AI today, right? It's not surprising that China has its DeepSeeks or its Tsinghua universities, Peking universities that can compete with the best in terms of innovation in AI. So what are the institutional adaptations that matter? There's so many institutions we could choose from. We could talk about democracy versus autocracy. We could talk about different systems of industrial organization. I focus on skill formation because I think human capital permeates everything else. And it's really important. It's one of the key bottlenecks to technology development. Why I focus on institutions that widen the base of engineering skills and knowledge is because of this second problem here, the second demand that GPTs pose. You need to have a lot of information flows between the GPT sector and all these different application sectors. And that's unique. You don't need that for electric vehicles. You don't need the education sector to know what's happening in the electric vehicle industry. You don't need the construction sector to know what's happening in the electric vehicle industry. You do need the education sector to know what's happening in the AI industry. You need, okay, so if you're building a AI-empowered tutoring service, you need to know, okay, how do I benchmark these different large language models? Which one's going to be more effective? Which one's going to be better? In the construction industry, you need to know what's happening in the AI industry. You need to know if, hey, this transformer wave that's gone through natural language processing, is that going to come to computer vision too? And is there going to be applications in the construction sector? Those information flows get systematized and standardized in engineering knowledge. So it's no surprise, you have a new GPT, oftentimes you have a completely new engineering discipline, electricity and electrical engineering. The computer science, doesn't have the word engineering in it, very much an engineering-oriented discipline. Okay, if you zoned out for the past 5-10 minutes or so, this is the summary of the argument. Okay. There are 4 dimensions on which these 2 different explanations differ. The leading sector, the traditional wisdom, versus the GPT diffusion theory, my theory. Leading sectors, it's about that almost instantaneous impact timeframe of these technologies. GPTs take a long time to incubate and spread. That shapes what phase of technological change we care about most. Monopoly on innovation versus edge in diffusion across the entire economy. Is breadth of growth and technological change concentrated in just a few great industries, or is it dispersed throughout the entire economy? And then what are the institutional adaptations? For a leading sector, it might be, can we train the best and the brightest? Can we prevent crown jewels from leaking out? Can we invest in the most cutting edge R&D? Sort of, it's oftentimes the boilerplate suggestions we see in all these white papers. For GPT diffusion, it's about widening the engineering skill base in a GPT. Okay, so we're going to go through all these dimensions and see which side does the historical evidence stack up in favor of. So take you back to 1870 to 1914, Second Industrial Revolution. All these amazing innovations are coming out. And also, crucially, you have a shift in the global economic balance of power. This is the relative decline of the United Kingdom and the rise of Germany and the US. One nation to multi-nation industrial system. Key point of background, we care about productivity. That's the key determinant of long-term economic growth differentials. The US in the blue becomes the clear productivity leader here, surpassing Britain. Germany doesn't get close. And so what we're trying to explain in this case is how did the US take advantage of the innovations of the second industrial revolution and become the clear preeminent economic power before World War I? That's the question. Okay, when we trace the impact of these technologies, when did they make their mark on these different countries? It's very hard to make the case that the chemical industry, which was one of the most advanced leading sectors at this time, it's very hard to make the case that they had this immediate impact in the US. The US was very slow to establish industrial research labs. You trace other technologies, we probably have the most data on when electricity made its mark on US productivity. Consensus is only after 1914. It wasn't just skills adjustments. It wasn't just you needed complementary innovations, you needed the Parsons steam turbine, but it was also you needed organizational changes. So before then, factories were powered by the central shaft and belt system connected to a steam engine. Then gradually, people were like, we have electric dynamos, so now maybe we can power a group of machines with an electric dynamo. That was called group drive. And then people realized, wait, actually, we need to completely restructure factories to be a more decentralized layout and shift to unit drive, where every individual machine is powered by electricity. This takes time. Similar story for some of these other technologies. What was the key timing? It was actually these incremental advances in these past technologies, and these technologies incubated much earlier in the 1840s, 1850s. Breakthroughs in machine tools, the turret lathe, the universal milling machine, lets you cut and shape metal and wood in more precise ways to create standardized parts, interchangeable parts manufacture. So if your backpack broke down, you didn't have to recreate the backpack, you could just fix the part that broke, the strap that broke. And that would apply to not just backpacks, but sewing machines and bicycles and firearms and all these different industries that this general purpose technology impacted. And note the timeline, right? Multiple decades, 30, 40 years before you had this torrential diffusion of machine tools throughout American industry. Phase advantage. Was the US the innovation monopolist? Did the US first introduce all these new to the world innovations? It's not very clear that they were this leading light of innovation. Actually, when the British Institute of Electrical Engineers is judging it, they say we're not that far behind in this inventive genius in electric science. It's more about this practical application. When we look at machine tools, the US doesn't have exclusive access to these special advanced tools. It's more about differences in adoption across all branches of industry. All these countries send these inspection teams to the US to try to figure out what's the secret sauce, what's happening here. They report back adaptation, eagerness of diffusion, and spread throughout every department of industry. Okay, last technological dimension is economic growth concentrated in just a few great sectors. No, it's actually technological change and productivity growth is broad-based, reflective of a GPT at work. Finally, what does that mean for institutional adaptations? If I'm right, it's not so much that the US had this deeper skill base or had the best and the brightest talent. It's more that the US was able to broaden this base of mechanical engineering skills and systematize and standardize knowledge in this area. Britain simply didn't produce enough. Germany did produce enough, but they couldn't standardize that knowledge in this strong engineering discipline. So one piece of evidence to support that, this is a US Bureau of Education report that translated a German engineering professor's analysis of the differences between the two engineering school systems. Top three are schools representative of the German model. Bottom two are of the US. Darker shaded lines show the amount of time spent during the curriculum in practical exercises in the lab and shop. And that's where there's the clear difference, the advantage for the US system here. Okay, last historical point. Really, at this time, the most scientifically advanced industry is the chemical sector. Okay, and a lot of the traditional analysis is all about Germany developed this advantage in innovation in the chemical sector. And that's true. They were winning all these Nobel Prizes, producing the best cutting edge research. The best and the brightest in the US went to Germany to study chemistry for their PhDs. And this quote here reflects it. US is far from the frontier in this scientific leadership and this innovation capacity leadership, but the US has this advantage in introducing chemical engineering, where it's not just about who can export more dyestuffs. Think who can export more electric vehicles today. It's about who can develop these standard processes of chemicalization, titration, crystallization. Don't ask me to list a third because I don't know. But who can adopt these standard practices through not just the synthetic dyestuffs industry, but food preservation, metallurgy, petroleum, and all these different application sectors that would use chemical engineering practices. Okay. I'm not going to go through the other cases. I just wanted to show you the other cases to put up the structure that it's the same set of 4 dimensions that we're tracing. Did it support GPT diffusion or leading sector? Most of the evidence is in favor of the GPT diffusion theory. Now, I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion. I know Peter's done a lot of work here. My interpretation of the US-Japan competition case is at this time, so many people are pontificating and speculating Japan will become the #1 technological power in the 1980s, 1990s. And this is my favorite quote in the book. Look, in the heat of this competition between the US and Japan, these very astute analysts are saying, look at what's happening in Japan's dominance in consumer electronics and all these other leading sectors. It draws parallels to what happened with Germany in the chemical sector in the Second Industrial Revolution. Why did Japan not eventually overtake the US in technological leadership? Well, I think they're using the wrong template here. They're using the leading sector template. Here, Japan did not lead the US in the diffusion of the key GPT of this era of the computer. If you look at computerization rates and the adoption of computer in service sectors. It's a difference in, the chapter points to differences in software engineering training for one of the explanations. Okay. Back to that first slide, what does it all mean for US-China competition in AI and what some have deemed the 4th Industrial Revolution? I think most of our analysis and thinking in policy and scholarly circles is very much influenced by that leading sector model. And so really, if you adopt the GPT diffusion model, it suggests very competing, almost opposing findings for all of these dimensions. And we're just going to go through them one by one. So leading sector model says, hey, these technologies make an almost near immediate impact. It's just about these fast growing initial leading sectors. I'm not a big subtweeter. A lot of people say, some people say this. I like to call out people who I disagree with. So National Security Commission on AI. I was a special government employee and consulted on this final report. They didn't listen to me, but they think the main impact of AI on US-China competition is within the decade. Graham Allison, Harvard Belfair professor, Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, probably one of the most influential behind the scenes technology policy advisors in the US today. All say main impacts will happen within this decade. GPT diffusion model, if you take the lessons of history seriously, we could probably date the arrival of this new deep learning GPT 2012 with the AlexNet submission to Stanford's ImageNet competition. If history serves as a guide, it should take multiple decades. We shouldn't see huge economic payoffs until after 2030. Okay, phase of advantage. Is it about innovation or diffusion? Look at all the analysis of how's China doing compared to the US in AI. It's all indicators like this. Who's got the best frontier firms? Who's spending the most on R&D? Who's got the most valuable startups? If you take GPT diffusion seriously, actually China ranks pretty middling in terms of taking those innovations from those frontier firms and universities and spreading them throughout the entire economy. If you care about productivity, it's not just about the most advanced sectors, and we have good indicators of adoption rates of cloud computing, industrial software, and all these different information communications technologies development indexes. So I wrote a separate paper that did this comparison. I won't go into detail. Basically, one of the exercises was, let's take all these science and technology indicators that I've published from all these different organizations around the world that rank different countries, divide them into the ones that most align with innovation capacity on the left, and then sort some of the others into ones that align more with diffusion capacity. So gross expenditures on R&D, just how much is your government spending on cutting edge R&D? Global R&D companies takes the average R&D spending of your top 3 companies. So your Alibaba's, Baidu's, maybe in the US would be like your big tech companies, your Qualcomm, stuff like that. QS university rankings, the average research ranking, the average ranking of your top 3 research universities. Right, so China performs really well in this. The average is very close to all these other science and technology superpowers. If you go into information and communications technology access and use, if you talk about how well do different parts of your science and technology ecosystem talk to each other, so university industry research collaboration, how well do those ideas get spread and disseminated? China ranks pretty middling in terms of average global rankings. I call this a diffusion deficit in science and technology power. Okay, last technological dimension. Should we focus on strategic emerging technologies, strategic emerging industries? I know Barry, IGCC, other folks here have done a lot of great studies about all of China's efforts to target these specific, pick winners in these specific industries. Actually, you have state council affiliated think tanks in China that are saying, hey, instead of just focusing on these new technologies, maybe we should adopt this more diffusion-oriented, economy-wide approach. Okay, lastly, who is better positioned, right? Who has if you fed the chessboard position into a computer, who would have a better chance of winning right now? For me, I think there's a preliminary case for a U.S. advantage in broadening the space of engineering skills and AI. One of the exercises I did was how many universities in each country have just one researcher affiliated with it that has published in an established AI conference, a very low quality baseline for being able to train good engineering talent. China has, I think, 29 of those universities. US has 159. So once you get past the Tsinghuas, the Pekings, the Nanjings of the world, the US just by comparison have this much broader and deeper bench of institutions that can train engineering talent. Remember, we care about information spreading and getting standardized across all different parts of the science and technology ecosystem. Another quick indicator here is how many AI publications do you have with at least one co-author from industry and one co-author from academia? US leads the world on this metric. China, about half the rate, faces significant challenges in this space. Last thing, what does this all mean for US policy? This is a foreign affairs op-ed I published last year that summarizes some of the key takeaways from the book. I think the US has largely adopted the leading sector model, and it's become essentially a Fortress America type approach to competing with China on AI, trying to prevent crown jewels from leaking out. It's very tough to monopolize innovation in a field as broad as a GPT. History tells us that. Instead, the US should adopt this run faster model, where there should be more investment in broadening the base of AI engineering talent. First and foremost, damage control and not undermine our public universities, as Peter was saying in the beginning. But I think I'm not that interested in the Harvards of the world. For one of the policy implications, it's how do you invest in community colleges to broaden pathways to training engineering talent? And it's more about this GPT skill infrastructure. Okay, thanks for staying with me. I threw a lot at you all there. Essentially, this is trying to provide a better understanding of how technology affects the rise and fall of great powers. So if this caught your interest, I think they're doing a book sale here. Or if you just need a little bit more faded orange color in your life, please do pick up a copy, and looking forward to the discussion of all. Great.
So that was terrifically concise for a very complicated book in some ways, with a clear bottom line, but dealing with rich historic cases that have lots of factors. I want to start by saying that I agree with you about the importance of thinking about this broader phenomenon of the spread of technology. I actually have a new working paper coming out from my GCC that argues AI is overrated in understanding the transformation, because it's really digital technology as a whole and its impact. AI is just one part of that story. But it's my job to comment and to be provocative. So I'll do that. Part of the problem in doing essentially almost 200 years of history and linking technology to a change in power is that even in your own model, in talking about two distinct models, you in fact have a lot of overlapping variables. It takes for general diffusion to work institutional adaptation for that to occur. In the leading sector model, there's also institutional adaptation. In the book, for reasons that time didn't permit, Jeffrey also talks about different models about how capitalism can be organized and whether that plays a role. So let me just take a couple of thought examples to examine the thesis. More to say, I have a lot of sympathy, but I have a lot of caution as well. Let's take the 19th century story of Germany, the UK, and the US. At the time that the leading sector literature was really coming out in international relations, there was a brilliant short essay by one of the great economic historians of our time, Deirdre McCloskey. And McCloskey asked, why was it that Germany overtook the United Kingdom? And the leading sector people said, oh, Britain made the wrong choices about how to drive its leading sector. McCloskey ran a model to asking, how much better would the UK have to have been to actually overcome Germany? And the numbers were preposterous. And McCloskey's conclusion was simple, that above a certain level of productivity, efficiency, if you would, in the working of the economy, quantity may matter more than comparative efficiency for the purpose of judging great powerness. You attribute the German U.S. case to the difference in engineering skill diffusion. But taking the McCloskey logic, if you look at the population of the United States and Germany in 1900, the U.S. has about 35% more people than the German population base, and is a continental economy, not a relatively small geographic area. There are a lot of mistakes that can be covered up by the scale. And now we get to the institutional argument, one that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is that continental-wide experience led to a transformation in the business structure of the United States. Alfred Chandler is the economic historian who made this famous. And that led to a managerial structure that in fact could do and did do this type of standardization of engineering. So it wasn't engineering that was the independent variable. It was the outcome of the institutional changes within, although the engineering transformation was quite important. Again, I'm being provocative. All right. So let me jump forward to the story of the US and Japan facing off in information and communications technology. I'm quite sympathetic to your point that the US had a broader technological base, but I want to use this story to point to, again, the institutional issue and also to the relationship between what other scholars call the difference between novel product innovation and incremental product innovation, a literature that you cite and know well. The US, since 1945, has put an enormous bet into a broad-based novel product innovation structure. We call it basic and advanced research, where we are the largest vendor in the world by any standard you can think of although the Trump administration may undo that rapidly. Now, that system is not sealed off hermetically, but rather it produces the type of intense skill and advanced, if you would, techniques. Call them electromagnetic microscopes. Call them whatever else you want to look at in the way of instrumentation that become the basis of, in a sense, the skills system.
Yeah.
So you can't talk about that incremental system, which is what a lot of software engineering is, without a reference to its linkage and how it works to the advanced prototype. And it was the breadth and the scope of the American basic and advanced engineering system that made a difference. And I'll just note that your story about the German engineering departments and the American engineering departments at the turn of the 19th century is absolutely right. But if you did the same story today, guess what it would look like? The U.S. engineering departments in the leading universities look like the German engineering departments back then, right? It's just we have a lot more of them, and they're spread across a larger base. So I think that the linkage here is important, and then I'll just tell a personal story. By accident of history, I was in the Clinton administration, in the group around Al Gore, who were dealing with the internet revolution. And frankly, I think that the thing that made the most difference in the competition between the US and Japan and leadership in information and communications technology was not that we had a broader engineering base, although that certainly was a help, but it was because we had the capacity to actually undertake an institutional transformation to take advantage of the internet, which, since I did the discussions with the Japanese government when we explained to them what the internet meant for the competition and watched them looking, going, you're kidding us, right? And this was not a fight. This was like, they were shocked because they indeed had an institutional plan for advancement as a leading sector, built around supercomputing. And this was a totally different way. But it almost didn't happen in the US unless there had been a re-engineering the basic market structure for information and communications technology and a way of clearing out the path to the diffusion of the internet inspired innovations that you rightly point to as a general advantage. So my only point here is, I think these stories get more complicated. And then when you get to China, we have here people who are certainly expert more than I am on Chinese innovation. But I'm not so sure that that work on robotics and facial recognition and sensors that's going on across the Chinese industrial base doesn't look a lot like the diffusion that you're talking about. And whether it shows up in those formal numbers or not, it seems to be a real thing that's growing. Now, I'm not as pessimistic as the pessimists are about this. I share that with you. And I certainly think the idea that you're going to stop them from learning this technology is an incredibly stupid misreading of economic history. But I do think that by the metrics you're talking about, there may be a lot more strength in China than you're thinking about. So for all of you, this is simply saying that Jeff has done something brave in the world of modern political science. He's written a big book with a big thought and taking on a big problem, and he's made a really significant, interesting contribution to the problem. It's a big problem, and so it's one that can't be neatly resolved, and we got to think in nuances, but it was an experience that I enjoyed, and now I hope we can turn this over to all of you to ask questions, and thanks for listening to me rant for a couple of minutes. All right. All right. First question. I've seen you taking such diligent notes there. You had to get recognized first.
Thank you. I'd appreciate to hear your perspectives on it.
What's your name?
Jax.
Jax.
is it possible that there's something different about the nature of AI as a GPT that would make it diffuse a lot faster than GPTs of the past? And that if that is the case, could the argument be made that it would make more sense to approach it as if it were a leading sector?
Yeah.
And like maybe the metric then, because of its autonomous nature, that the number of universities with professors who have published in journals might not be as relevant if it's gonna autonomously diffuse.
Yeah.
I would just be curious to hear your take.
Yeah, it's a great question. First, let me just say, yeah, Peter, thank you for sort of the in-depth engagement with the arguments of the book, and I think a lot of your points are spot on. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about in dinner afterwards. Let me get to this question. So, I think for me, I am completely open to the idea that AI is something very different. I think the point of this book is to say, if we think it's sort of taking like the outsider's view, if we think AI is a GPT, here's what the past lessons we've learned from GPTs, and here's what that would suggest for AI. I'm completely open to the insider view, people who might be more plugged into what's happening in Anthropic or OpenAI and maybe think we'll get to artificial general intelligence by 2027. I'm open that they have some knowledge that sort of maybe AI is recursively self-improving, so we'll get 100 million programmer, like high quality level programmer AIs, and that will lead to fast takeoff type scenarios. I just think sometimes that those notions dominate the conversation. And so the point is to rebalance it more towards, okay, if we treat this as a category of GPTs, here's the outsider view. And even I think a lot of those same arguments you were just making, people might have thought applied to computers as well. We don't need to put that much infrastructure. We can just spread everything through the internet. With computers, maybe people thought were also recursively improving. And it took a really long time. We saw the computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics, according to Solo's famous paradox. So for me, I personally, like on the page, I say, hey, the people who think AI is going to be fundamentally different, they might be right. But I think personally, I'm more on the camp that we'll see very slow diffusion in AI as well. Arvind and Sayash have this paper called AI as a normal technology that kind of fleshes out some of these points I just made in more detail if you're interested.
I'm gonna go back one and then I'm gonna go to Barry. Go ahead.
I feel lucky. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming here and giving this presentation and writing this book and helping us think about these issues. I really appreciate that. I have a stupid question. When you talk about diffusion with respect to AI,
Beware of stupid questions.
I'm sitting here just thinking about myself. I'm a lawyer, a tech lawyer, lived in China many years, and I'm just thinking about myself. Every day, I'm sitting here trying to figure out, okay, how do I do what I used to do the old way? How do I do it the new way with these AI tools?
Yeah.
And when you think about diffusion, I mean, is it just like a million little people like me? Because these models are right out there, right?
Yeah.
We can download all the apps. Everybody's got access to everything.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sorry, I met you before the Chad or
Greg.
Greg.
Thank you.
So I think the basic answer is I care more about business side diffusion. So how do all these small and medium-sized businesses adopt and implement large language models or computer vision models to improve productive processes? I do think the consumer-facing stuff does make a difference. It's harder to map that onto productivity, which is the ultimate outcome I care more about. A lot of people have been thinking about this problem in terms of maybe we're actually mismeasuring productivity because we're not accounting for the effects of digital technologies on consumers. But yeah, I'm thinking about more like how you as an individual in a business would improve your your business operations and production processes. So like one example for me is like, I was trying to write, sort of try to develop like a web scraper to scrape all these requests for comments documents and pull out author information on a web page just 2 days ago. And yeah, I did just ask it to Claude or ask it to GPT. And this goes back to Jackson's question, is for me is like, I didn't have the requisite knowledge and engineering knowledge about building a web scraper. So I went to the best models and still really difficult for me to do that. And it's still not working. And so that's the type of process of diffusion I'm thinking about. At what point does someone like me in a company that needs to build a web scraper, at what point can that really improve my productivity in doing that?
All right, to Barry Naughton, and then.
Yeah, so Barry, just thinking about China by these metrics, I mean, of course, I'm struck that your core recommendation of increasing the training of sort of junior college level engineers, that's exactly what China is doing, right? It's producing 10 times as many as we are. But more broadly, if we think of the kind of indicators you put up there, on the right-hand side column, I mean, they're all very much, systemic indicators of the profound institutional inefficiencies of China, which have been there for a long time. They're pretty embedded, for sure, they're real. But if you think about the strategy for diffusion, China, despite these grandiose comments by Liu He and Xi Jinping and all these other people, their actual strategy is actually kind of closer to what you're saying, because if you think of Kai-Fu Lee's argument about, granted, it's a long time ago before large language models, but back then he said, China's good at the applications, we're behind on the theory, but look, we've got lots of these little small scale applications, and you've got all these industrial spillovers, and they're investing like crazy. The return's really low, but they're pouring the money into it. It kind of seems like they're doing what you would advise them to do.
Yeah, so a lot there to unpack. And so I think first, they're investing a lot in junior colleges, these doctrine. This is getting a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but I think for a lot of these junior colleges, they're not adding much in the way of
Agreed,
quality.
but I didn't necessarily literally mean, but just as you said, those other universities that aren't
Yeah.
beta.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say there is, how do you make vocational education or alternative pathways actually genuine ways to train the engineering talent you would need for AI? I don't think a lot of these like junior colleges in Henan are adding that much in terms of quality AI engineering education. I think the 10 times as many engineers and STEM graduates, those numbers for me, that's why I was trying to get at, there has to be some baseline quality metric. That you say, the ones that count are the ones that meet this baseline quality metric.
Sure.
And try to do that in the book, and I think
So
the
it's
US
3 to
has the
1 or
thing.
4 to 1, but it's still big.
Well, I mean, on the baseline quality metric I use, it's 159 to 29 in favor of the US. I mean, we can debate about the numbers, but I think for me, and this goes back to the scale, maybe it has a quality of its own. For me, that yes, but also scale means you need more engineers. It's a density question. It's not enough to just have Shenzhen and first-tier cities or the most developed coastal provinces. You need those technologies to also transfer into the inland provinces and the small and medium-sized businesses in the towns that never make it into English language coverage. And yes, that does go to the systemic stuff you were talking about. Maybe I'll leave it there, but I mean, the points are taken. I would say this idea that the US might actually have a strong advantage in AI engineering is the one that I've gotten the most pushback on. So I think it's a debate to be had.
All right, Lei is representing our online viewers.
Hi, Jeff. There are 2 questions from online. One is from Abraham Wu, that's somewhat related to Barry's question. He asks whether the competitive dynamics of upgrading are different when diffusion happens as an autonomous, I suppose, organic process
Yeah.
versus when the state assumes an active, even paternal role. So that's the first question. Second question is specific about the US. So asking you to outline top 3 specific things the US should do next to shift away from the leading sector model toward more of a GPT model that you outlined.
Yeah, so I think these questions are related. This idea of autonomous paternal role, I think for me, I take that as a decentralized versus centralized approach to encouraging GPT diffusion. Some ways this goes to Barry's question, but also Peter's point earlier about US-Japan competition, where I would say Japan took a very centralized approach to computing. We're going to do computers through mainframes, invest in this 5th generation paradigm. I think one of the biggest US advantages is the decentralized approach, and that's especially important for GPTs because you can't predict where the technology is going. If I were giving this talk 2 years ago, we wouldn't be talking as much about large language models. We might be talking more about facial recognition and computer vision. If you went all in on a policy with a long-term plan on a technology paradigm that's constantly shifting, it's hard to do, I think. In terms of the top 3 specific things the US should do, I mentioned a few of them with community colleges, broadening the STEM workforce. The one thing I'll mention that's low-hanging fruit is we have the CHIPS and Science Act, one of the most ambitious acts and most ambitious industrial policies since the post-war period. And everyone focuses on the CHIPS part because that's the leading sector part. Who can produce more fabs, who can capture this share of the leading sector in semiconductors. And science part to me is the most important. There were a lot of planks about investing in the STEM workforce. And even in the Biden administration, I'll give you one guess which plank got more attention and resources and political capital to get money authorized and allocated and ultimately funded. And so some of it is just, we have this infrastructure to improve the STEM workforce, just have to invest in it. The one other thing to Abraham, I would say is Minerva Technology Advisors did a policy report summarizing all these different policies that would put AI adoption in the forefront from all around the world. And there's a list of a lot of different policy options there too.
What about immigration?
Yeah, I mean, so from the Japan case, for me, one of the reasons the US was able to develop a broader base of software engineering talent is they were able to tap into a global pool, whereas Japan was much more insular. So I think there's obvious implications there.
So we're running to the close of the time available. So I'm going to take the 2 hands that are up. One is back in the corner there, one is up here. And ask them each to ask their questions and make them short. And then I'll give Jeffrey time to respond. Okay,
One more online question?
no more. Starting in the back.
Ways not chasing retirees. Do you foresee AI replacing the creative human mind? Your thoughts.
All right, that's a big question. All right, in front.
I have one question I'd like to ask you after, but regarding, I feel like a lot of the American public focuses on large language models,
Yes.
and those AI models suffer a lot from self-feedback loops, which can delay the outputs that they have and whether or not they're correct. Do you think it would be better if we focused on industrial application AI for automation purposes, rather than large language models as a policy going forward?
Yeah.
So the micro and the macro in these last 2 questions.
Yeah, replacing the creative human mind. I'll give you from my perspective. So I do a weekly newsletter where I translate Chinese writings on AI related topics. And where AI is making the most difference is just the machine translation, especially of news articles, is really, really good. Machine translation of neural machine translation of white papers and government documents is really, really good. And so when I invite people to contribute to the newsletter, that's not the part that's hard to get. The part that's hard to get is to find the Chinese language sources that are the most interesting, that you think are the most interesting, that element of creativity in taste. How do you develop that taste? I feel like AI models will have a hard time developing that. It's more like just glossing over like glossing over huge masses of data. In terms of the smaller question, I think there's this focus on LLMs because there's been such a strong performance increase in these models, and they do feed into industrial processes. But to your point, the challenge of GPTs is they're constantly evolving, and as I alluded to, and we talked about a little bit in the discussion, it could be that computer vision and using computer vision to detect defects in the production line early on, something called machine quality inspection could be a real game changer too. So I think you have to make almost specific AI subfield agnostic policy is the very confounded way I would put it, but that's what I was thinking about in response to your question.
I might add as a footnote to that, that if you think about big bets being made in the technology industry, Apple is a paradigmatic leader of the bets that are being made that large LLMs are not where the payoff is going to be out of AI, that it's going to be in more specialized mid-sized models. And much of that action will actually take place on the mobile device.
Yeah.
With backup into the cloud, but as much as possible on the device. So there are real splits of large money bets being made in this space. But one thing we can say for sure is that Jeffrey has made us a lot smarter about thinking about both the sweep of history and some of the current choices. So let's thank him very much for that.